Here we go. Hi, what up? Hey, Liz.
Hey, good evening. Good evening.
Good evening. Let's see who else is on. Got some people joining. How you feeling today? I know you've been out there in them streets,
Now,
healing the people. No. For those of you who are joining, thank you for just coming on to the live, to the Men's Healing Live 90 Days, 90K IG Live series. We are super excited to have our guest on tonight. Um, and a dear friend of mine, someone who I care a lot about. Again, just a really quick note is just that, the real purpose of this is to highlight all of the folks who are affiliated with Men Healing, people who are doing healing work, supporting people in the community, specifically men in the community who've been impacted by different forms of violence, trauma, and Men Healing's focus specifically on male survivors of sexual abuse. And tonight I have my dear friend Lisa Wilson Good, who's going to be on, and she's going to be talking a little bit about herself. I'm probably going to crack some jokes because I always do that, just because. And I'm also going to brag about her like I always do. Um, so Lisa, let's just jump right in and tell folks about Urban Grief. Tell folks about Urban Grief, the work you've been doing, and like what brought you to that work.
so Urban Grief is a project that I started in 2001, and it was in response to what I saw as the obvious unmet needs of Black and Brown folks living in the urban areas of where I live. And for me, seeing what I now know as health disparities really take a toll on our community, with knowing and seeing lots of families devastated by deaths related to all sorts of treatable and preventable illnesses,
Mm,
seeing people and knowing of people dying from overdoses, HIV, AIDS at that time,
mm,
and then also violence, right? Homicide. And so
mm,
when I started Urban Grief, one of the questions that I sought to answer in terms of just kind of doing an assessment was to, ask the question, where were the resources around support, or even the recognition that people in our community needed support after loss.
mm,
And, pretty much what I saw was, one one mainstream white institution, but it didn't really reach the folks that needed to be reached in a way that I thought was relevant.
mm,
And so, kind of since 2001, I kind of been treading along,
mm,
made myself a content expert in the area of grief through a lot of trainings, workshops, readings. But one of the things that I learned really quickly is that it didn't quite fit, so to speak. There was
mm,
there was always this gap between the literature and the information that I was learning and how it needed to be applied to people in the community. So for a long time, I was told that, oh, that, you're not qualified
mm,
to help those people. And that was something that, it actually internalized to some degree. But I've outlived all of that.
mm,
Um, and so over time, I started to center my work more specifically around um, the grief and the trauma associated with violence.
mm,
And you can't do that without talking and looking specifically at Black men.
mm,
And so, here we are, 20 years later, I guess 19 plus years later, and Urban Grief is, an established name. We show up to the best of our ability with the resources that we have to
mm,
try to make an impact in the lives of individuals and community members who have been impacted by violence, and that a lot of that does involve Black men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, I'm going to brag a little bit. So, Lisa is a nationally recognized, expert when it comes to trauma and grief, and specifically as it relates to boys, to communities of color. Her and I have been working for I don't know how long it's been, but she's not gonna get it right. I usually get it right when I say how long we've known each other,
Right.
how long we've been working.
Right.
But 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 yeah, and it's an understatement to say, the work that she does. I mean, she's at the hospital beds, she's holding vigils in the community, she's, talking to the families, supporting the families, she's holding healing spaces and circles for families and members of the community. Her and I co-facilitated, along with two other friends of ours and colleagues of ours, Black Men Grieve series that we were hosting on Monday evenings to create space for Black men of color, to really just process the loss that many of us have had in a very, variety of ways, right? And so, Lisa, do me a favor, because I love the way you make this like distinction, but also draw parallels and like the connection between trauma and grief, because you were the first person that really helped me understand what grief was, and what that process looked like.
So, when it comes to, for me at least, when I think about, how grief impacts people, it's very similar. Um, it's similar to trauma, in as much as that when people are exposed to an event that causes grief, right? And there are like more than like 40 losses that, bring, a grief reaction, that can generate a grief reaction. And although we typically think about death, we know that historically in our communities, we have all of these other losses, but generally the socially sanctioned loss that people can actually name and get support and empathy or sympathy for is usually centered um, around death. But when I think about the physical impact, the cognitive impact, the stress response, the emotional aftermath, of grief, it's very similar to a trauma stress response, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when you think about some of the losses that we experience in our community, there's an overlap. That the elements of the loss are traumatic, right?
Mm-hmm.
The elements, so it's not just that I'm dealing with the loss, but also the elements of the loss that make the loss traumatic. And that's where you start to see the overlap. And the other thing about, grief is its enduring nature, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
that you have this acute event. If let's use death as an example, because that's fairly easy for people to understand. But you have this acute event, you have a grief response, and that sets off a chain reaction in terms of your stress response system. And that is enduring. As your grief ebbs and flows, that's enduring. And so one of the things that happens is, you have an increase in, the presence of stress hormones in your body.
Mm-hmm.
And, over time, when a stressful event is over, those cortisol levels, those stress hormones decrease. But with grief, they may increase, but due to the chronic and enduring nature of grief over time, that sometimes it doesn't go back all the way to normal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, and trauma is also very similar in that when there is chronic and multiple events and situations, or there's this cumulative um, these the cumulative experiences and cumulative losses, that we see that the stress response is on and it stays on, and then that in turn has a cyclical impact on mental health, emotional health, behavioral choices, but also our physical health and our
Mm-hmm.
immune systems. And so it's really, it's really a catch 22, so to speak. But I think that when it comes to grief, that there is a mourning that needs to occur over some of the losses. Like, a loss demands an outward expression, and although trauma demands an outward expression, I think there are more nuances around trauma, particularly when you talk about sexual trauma, that
Mm-hmm.
demand or push greater. The push for silence and shame and guilt and suppression is greater when it comes to sexual trauma and sexual violence than it is over here when I have a grief event in my life, and I'm grieving, and even though I may not exercise the option to outwardly express that or to
Right.
give vent to that, at least the option is there in some cases.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, no, you're hitting on all of the points, Lisa. And I'm thinking about one of the things that you shared with me, and it was really a poignant statement that you made. I think I was talking to you about my research around male survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and also my experiences being a survivor. And I remember you made this point, and you said, a parent or a caregiver, would not they would be less likely to leave their daughter with someone who they thought had any inkling of a thought that could potentially cause harm, specifically as it relates to sexual harm. But those same parents and caregivers would might even encourage, not thinking about, but they encourage relationships with their boys and folks who could potentially cause harm to them. Not thinking that way, but just thinking about the need, right? The need for mentorship, the need for a coach, and especially as we think about, many of the larger scale incidents that are occurring that has brought, mainstream attention to the issue of male survivorship, specifically for sexual abuse, right? We see that they involve situations in which folks were genuinely looking for mentors, coaches, guidance for their boys. And unfortunately, under those circumstances, those boys were harmed, right? And one of the things that, that was a point that just like really resonated with me. And it's not to cast aspersions on any parent. It just really just amplifies the distinction in the way that we look at boys as being less vulnerable than girls. And unfortunately, how that is playing a major role in the 1 in 6 boys under the age of 18, right, who has experienced sexual abuse. And so, that was huge. And then also, when you start talking about grief, you make me think about the ways in which my sexual abuse, as a child, really caused the loss of so many things, right? It caused a loss of safety for me. It caused a loss of boundaries for me. Right? And it caused, in some instances, it kind of compromised my identity as a child, as a boy, before I can even fully formulate what it was. And you couple that with like the experiences of racism, of white supremacy, and these larger systems of oppression cause a greater kind of grief, right? Or greater kind of loss for Black and brown people. So there's loss of safety externally in our communities, in our society. And did you have this experience of loss as it relates to sexual violence in your life? And it's like we're inundated and constantly experiences situations of loss. And I love the way you talk about that, particularly as it relates to like your work with working with men who've experienced various forms of loss and trauma. Talk a little bit about that for folks, please.
Well, I mean, wow, you kind of nailed it. But
Mm-hmm.
let's talk just for just let me start with the idea or the notion or of how we how we, because I have 2 sons. right?
Mm-hmm.
And, as a survivor, but I also have a daughter. Um, and so, and then this is why it's so necessary that we heal, because if we heal, then we have confidence in the capacity of other people to heal,
Right.
particularly our children, and our young adults. But so often, you know so in raising my kids, I did have this, as I went through my own journey, I had this hyper vigilance around the well-being of my kids, space and place, and where they were, and who they were with, and that kind of thing. And I also had it with regard to my sons. So it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
just, limited to my daughter, but I think that came in part, my awareness, that came in part specifically because of the work that I did in treatment with men, because
Mm.
I spent about 18 years working in substance abuse, and that work was, with all men. I mean, we had some women, but the facility that I ran, it had men. And so over the years, listening to their stories and helping them to get underneath their addictions and some of their self-destructive behavioral patterns, the trauma of their lives um, quickly emerges to the surface. But it was more the child abuse. But over
Mm-hmm.
time, I started to hear, as you build trust and credibility with, I'm talking about serving men, has I
Right.
built trust and credibility where they understood that I wasn't going to shame them or tear them
Mm-hmm.
down, um,
Mm-hmm.
for their behaviors, or embarrass them about their life experiences. What I learned is that it wasn't just in the information where it was a statistic about the frequency of how men had been abused, sexually abused as boys, but also it was in doing that work that I got a lot of exposure to this, to the idea that it wasn't just men who were abusing boys, but that it was also women who were abusing boys. So when we think about the safety of where we send our sons in search for athletic outlets and role models and mentoring and coaching and guiding and even faith,
Yep.
and even faith. When we think about where we send our boys and our men, um, rarely do we think about, give it a second thought when we send them into those spaces. That's the point that you were making. But
Yep.
also when it comes to women, we think that if we send them in, spaces where there's a bunch of women, that they're safe as well. And so when we think about safety,
Right.
and 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 how we enact that, with the protection of our boys from sexual violence, we've not looked at that piece. And ultimately, what I saw is that I saw just as many men who had been sexually violated by women as those who had been sexually violated by men. The difference is that for the young men or the boys who had been violated by women, that 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 was treated as almost a badge of honor, so
Right.
to speak, right? Um, and so I definitely, from my experience, I've seen that, how we look at safety for our boys and our young men of color when it comes to sexual violence is distinct, it is very different than than how we look at for our girls.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's and it's a part of a bigger conversation around um, the perception that we have, right? That's based on, this concept of patriarchy that we've all internalized, men and women alike, right? To view boys as less likely of being vulnerable, and therefore not as deserving of the same type of safety as girls. And I know, firsthand, how that will cause you to view yourself and the role that that plays. And this is something else that you lose, right? That role that that plays in some of that behavior choices that you were talking about, right? Boys who experience sexual abuse oftentimes becoming, hypersexual, and engaging in these self-destructive behaviors like substance abuse, right? Similar to the story you were just sharing, it wasn't until I was in a prison where all of these men who had hit this breaking point, and that's the other piece that's missing when we talk about the disclosure period and how it's delayed for male survivors. Oftentimes we say, oh, why did this person wait, to their 30, to their 40? Um, a lot of times it comes with a series of other types of like traumas that they've experienced, that as a result of them being put on this path from this initial traumatic experience that influences these decisions, that are essentially trauma responses, that they get to this place where they're having an overdose or where they're incarcerated, that you find yourself at rock bottom, that you start to put these pieces together. But the point that you made about creating a space that is open, essentially a safe space, right? So what you're doing, what therapists are doing, what you were able to do was to create a safe space to kind of buffer all of those previous experiences in where their safety was compromised, in a way that allowed them to be able to start talking about some of that stuff, that we oftentimes, hid as a result of shame, hid as a result of not feeling like we were men, and we did not, protect ourselves, because that's the piece that I want to emphasize, right? As boys internalizing these notions of masculinity, we believe that, even if we're 5 years old, we get the message that we should be protecting ourselves and we shouldn't allow anyone to harm us. And that's a tremendous amount of weight that we put on our boys, that we put on our babies. I remember, and I'm going to let you talk because I feel like, how we do, but there was one of our Black Men Grieve conversations, and it really hit me, and during that conversation, when I thought about it, and it brought tears to my eyes, because I was just like, and even when I think about it, right, it's like we raise our boys and we don't share the same type of messages even to them, right? And I was like, dang, I was never told that my body was sacred. I was never told, to protect myself. We're quick to say that, and I think it's understandable because we want to, be over, quote unquote, overprotective for our girls. But those boys, our boys, I tell my sons all the time, your body is sacred. You know, be mindful of your body. Like I tell them these things, not to cause fear, but to let them know that your body is sacred. That plays a major role in what we consume, the behaviors we make. It can also become like a buffer to counter some of that stuff, because
Right.
we know it's unfortunate to think that we can try to prevent it to happen. That's the hardest thing, to prevent it from happening with so much going on. I talked a lot, and I
Yeah,
want you to
I
finish
I
up
think
talking.
that the idea that your body is sacred is, and I remember that Black Men Grieve, right? That idea that, we teach, or we attempt to instill in our girls that, yeah, your body is precious. You don't
Mm-hmm.
share that, with just anyone. It's not meant for a casual, you know, um, fling, that kind of thing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that, has a child, that you don't, you let anybody touch you, or, so I think that to some degree, you know, all children are, especially when you get to the disclosure side, um, you know, are typically not believed or blamed in some way for their own victimization,
Yeah.
especially Black and brown children.
Yeah.
that even if your son is big and he's tall for his age, or if a young woman or girl is developed, you know, for her age, that by virtue of physical development and puberty and body size, that somehow or another that body invites
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, you know, invites sexual violence towards it. And I think that, you know, when it comes to that, you know, on some level, at least people try to communicate that to girls, maybe not. I know I did with my daughter, but you're absolutely right. When it comes to our boys, we don't say that your body is sacred. We don't, you know, because you got to think that in this highly sexual culture,
Mm-hmm.
that sex for boys is almost viewed as a rites of passage
That's right.
in manhood. And because, you know, culturally we've been separated from rituals in community that create these natural rites of passages for our boys that were healthy and meaningful and facilitated by safe men and women. um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you know, absent absent of that, you know, sexuality or sex or the, you know, the organ is viewed as that male's rite of passage, that boy's rite of passage into manhood. So whereas a girl that's 11 or 12 years old that is found to be sexually active, that's a great stigma and shame. Where and or it's looked at as immediate, okay, you know, he's 17, that's inappropriate, that's unacceptable. But you get
Right.
a boy at that same age and he's like, oh, get it, boy, you know,
Get it, boy.
you know,
Get it, boy.
get it, boy.
Yes.
And you know, I had a person that I worked with that at an early age, you know, their mom used to have card parties, and he was a big boy, nice looking, looked older than he was. And, you know, and the moms, you know, friends would flirt and whatever the case may be. And and no one saw that as inappropriate. And ultimately, you know, he was violated by some of those women. And this was an ongoing and enduring occurrence. And so therapeutically, it took a lot of boundaries and some work to help him to come, you know, to an understanding that he had been impacted. And once we were able to, you know, get that awareness in place, that so much of these other behaviors were linked to these early forms of sexual violation and sexual exploitation of his body by women, and that it was not a rite of passage, but that there had been violation and harm that he experienced that was now affecting his mental health and a whole bunch of other things. Then, you know, then he was able to make, you know, some progress. And so when I talk about the therapeutically safe space for men to do some of this work, that has a Black woman therapist, that one, I had to be um, comfortable in the work that I had done, right?
Mm-hmm.
It meant that in order to hold space for those kinds of narratives, I had to be okay with hearing about some of the dysfunctional behaviors that emerged out of those abusive experiences. But it also meant that I needed to be very clear, as a woman, not just as a therapist, but as a woman,
Mm-hmm.
around my boundaries.
That's right.
Because in some instances, you know, in some instances, you know, there were clients that I had that were accustomed to, you know, having inappropriate relationships with staff and therapists and other, you know, clinical settings. And I think that when we talk about safety, um, and how the body is viewed as sacred, that we have to communicate to our sons and to our boys and to our young men, that to have it's okay to have boundaries.
Yes.
It's okay to have boundaries. It's okay to say no. It's okay to not want to be sexually involved with a woman,
Mm,
or even a male partner. It's okay to not, it's okay. And that it doesn't make you less masculine because you view your body and the use of your genitalia as
mm,
sacred.
mm,
You view it as valuable and as sacred, and therefore you have agency and power over the who, what, when, and how. And going, and just one more thing about agency of body over the body of the black male body, and how they are robbed of that. They're also robbed of that through physical violence that comes from child abuse.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
um that comes from child abuse. So when I link that to the work that I do in terms of community violence, that there are many individuals who have experienced some of the most horrific forms of child abuse that I've ever heard. And a lot of that abuse occurred at the hands of women. Now, I'm not saying that men, you know what I'm saying?
Right. Yes.
I'm just
Yes.
trying to open up another stream
Yes.
of dialogue, that when we talk about healing,
Mm-hmm.
and it takes a village, in order for the village to heal other people, the villagers have to be honest about all of the pathways of harm and pain into our community, and to take responsibility where warranted, one, for our own personal journeys around healing, but also for the restorative work that needs to take place with our men and our boys.
Oh, go on and drop that mic. Um, yes, yes, yes. Amen to that. Lisa, pleasure. We could be talking forever. Quick shout out to Men Healing for creating this space. Amazing, amazing job, Lisa. Thank you so much for giving of your time and your wisdom. You can get in contact with Lisa. Lisa, you want to tell folks what your urban, like your IG, and any way they can get in contact with you if they want to hear more of your wisdom from the prophetess, huh?
So my Instagram handle is at Urban Grief. My Twitter handle is at Urban Grief. Um, Also, are any events or projects or programs that we are holding are generally posted on our Facebook page, Urban Grief. And certainly you can email me at lgood at urbangrief.org. And I see some of my people is on here. Hey, y'all.
All right, all right, y'all
So
got it.
you can reach
And
me.
thank you again, Min.
Take care.
Yes, please. And if you feel moved by this, donate to Men Healing so we can continue to create these safe spaces for men to come together and to heal. All right, peace, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday evening. Bye, Lise. I'll talk to you later.